you bloody well know that lots of times there's something under the carpet that no one wants to name, and everybody's thinking, well, as long as we don't name it, it's not really there. And in some sense it really isn't there, because you can act as if it's not there and get away with it, at least for short periods of time. But as soon as you name that thing, it's like you give it form and it's there and no one can ignore it. And that's annoying, because then you have to deal with it or face the consequences. But the reason I'm telling you that is because we have an intuition even that we can have things not exist by not naming them. You name it and it comes forward with staggering clarity. And it's not as if naming it is the only thing that gives it reality, but it is something like it. It sharpens it and brings it into focus and gives it borders and barriers and borders and boundaries. And so anyways, God's interested enough in what Adam has to say that he has him name all the animals, and that sort of makes them into animals. Now, there's more to the linguistic story than that. So the social psychologist Roger Brown was one of them, studied this really interesting phenomena which is associated with the relationship between perception and action. You know how a kid will call a particular animal a cat? Well, the word cat is very short, like the word dog. And it turns out that, you know, you could think that we could perceive cats as multicellular organisms. Like we could see the cells, we could see the molecules, we could see the atoms, we could see the ecosystem that the cat is part of. But we don't, or maybe the broader mammalian classification that it's part of. We could perceive that as the unit of perception, but we don't. We perceive things at the level of cat. And you can tell the perceptual level that people naturally perceive at, which doesn't seem to be socioculturally determined to any great degree, by the way, because the words are often short and easily remembered and early learned. And so there's this level of analysis. Out of all the possible levels of analysis that the world does exist at, we perceive it at a certain level of analysis, and that level of analysis seems to have something to do with the world's functional utility for us at that level. And the perception at that level and the naming at that level gives things a reality at that level. You know, because the thing about things is that they're not easily separable from other things. They tangle together in all sorts of strange ways. And yet when we cast our eye and use our language to orient ourselves in the world, we cut things up into discrete, discriminable objects that we can then utilize. And there's something about that that makes them real in a way that their interconnected potential, the interconnected potential that they were before that it's not real in the same way, at least. I think it's even less real. I think that's a right way of thinking about it, even though it's not completely unreal. But it's an echo. Adam's a little God at that point, a little God the Father, and God's already done the groundwork, but Adam has to come along and say, well, that's a cat. It's like, poof, whatever that is now a cat, and that's a dog, and that's a sheep. And you know, it gives them something like pragmatic form. But for Adam, there was not found a helpmeet for him. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept, and God took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. That's a walloping statement to put in there at the end of those 3 sentences. I mean, the therefore comes as somewhat of a surprise, but there's an injunction there. Well, it's a good injunction, man. I'll tell you, people who don't do that, they have a hell of a time in their marriage. And so this is a good thing to know. If you are married, or if you're planning to get married, is like, you know, we have very strong orientation towards our parents, and for good reason. It's like the injunction here is, that's secondary as soon as you're married. And failure to do that makes your marriage collapse. And then you deserve it to collapse too, as far as I'm concerned, because it's a reflection of your pathological immaturity and your unwillingness to extract yourself from the, you know, Talon-like grip of parents who are a little bit too much on the interfering side. But the injunction, there's a deep injunction here. It's very complicated. So one of the ideas is that the original Adam wasn't a man, like a separate man. It was more like a hermaphroditic being, and in that hermaphroditic being there was a kind of undifferentiated perfection, and then that was split into male and female, and then that part of the goal of human beings is to reunite that as the singular unity that reestablishes the initial perfection. And that's actually the goal of marriage from a spiritual perspective, and you could read about that if you read Jung, because he wrote quite a bit about that. It's lovely, it's such a good idea. So I had these friends that went to Sweden to get married. They were from northern Alberta, but his heritage, both their heritages were Swedish. And in this ceremony, they did this cool thing as they were being married, and they had to hold a candle up between them, right, while they were being married. And you think, well, okay, what's the candle? Well, it's a source of light. It's a source of illumination, right? It's a source of enlightenment. It's the candle that you put on Christmas trees in Europe. So it's the light that emerges in the darkness in the depth of winter. It's a symbol of life in darkness. It's the reemergence of the sun at the darkest, coldest time of the year, which is also associated symbolically with the birth of Christ for all sorts of complicated reasons. And so the candle's all that. And then the next question is, why do you hold it above you? And the answer is because what's above you is what you're below to. So it simplifies something transcendent. And so why do you both hold on to it? Well, because you're both supposed to hold on to the light, right? And you're supposed to be subordinate to the light. And so you ask, well, who's in charge in a marriage? Well, the light. That's the idea. So you come together as one thing. You're no longer two things. It isn't what's good for you, and it's not what's good for your wife. It's what's good for the marriage. And the marriage is about the combined being, which is the reassembly of the original hermaphroditic being at the beginning of time. That's the idea. And that's all packed into like these 4 sentences. And you know, there's been, well, all of these sentences have tremendous history of interpretation associated with them, right? It's just endless and endless and endless, and that's one of the lines. And so it's also an antidote to the idea that women taken out of men, which is obviously the reverse of the biological process, by the way, makes women in some sense subordinate to men. That is not built into this text. I don't see that at all is built into the text. And there's something else that's associated with it too, and there's an idea that